The groan of the wheels was a constant, grinding prayer against the iron tracks, a sound that had become the rhythm of Clara Mae Thompson's life for 6 days. It was the sound of escape. Outside the grimy window, Pennsylvania had dissolved into Ohio, then flattened into the endless, rolling plains of Nebraska. The world she had known, a world of damp city alleyways, the clatter of factory looms, and the suffocating scent of coal smoke, was a memory smeared away by the relentless westward motion. She sat on the hard wooden bench, her spine aching, her hands clutching a worn carpet bag on her lap. Inside were her only possessions: 2 simple calico dresses, a brush with several bristles missing, a small, dog-eared Bible, and a photograph of a man she had never met, Mr. Silas Miller. His face in the tintype was stern, the eyes looking somewhere past the camera, the beard neatly trimmed. He looked like a man who knew his own mind, a man who owned land, a man who had sent $50 for her passage to the Wyoming Territory, a man who would be her husband. Clara traced the edge of the bag with a trembling finger. Desperation was a taste she knew well, bitter as chicory coffee. Back in Lancaster, it had been the taste of every morning, waking in a cold attic room to the prospect of another day under the heavy, watchful gaze of Mr. Abernathy, her employer. He was a man whose kindness was a greasy film, whose compliments felt like spiders crawling on her skin. He had a wife, a brittle woman who smelled of lavender and disapproval, but his eyes followed Clara. His hand would find the small of her back as she served dinner, his fingers lingering just a moment too long. He spoke of her delicate features and the unfortunate circumstances that left a pretty girl like her scrubbing floors. The unspoken offer was always there, hanging in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. A warmer bed, better food, an easier life, all for a price that would cost her the last shred of herself. Poverty was a cage, but that kind of servitude was a grave. The newspaper advertisement had been her key, a single flickering candle in a world of darkness. Wives wanted in the West. Honorable, hard-working men seek respectable women for matrimony. Build a new life in a land of opportunity. She had answered the one from Mr. Silas Miller of Blackwood, Wyoming Territory. His letters were short, practical. He owned a small ranch. He needed a partner, a helpmeet. He promised a home and respectability. He had not promised love, and Clara had not dared to ask for it. All she wanted was a clean slate, a place where no one knew her name or the shadows that chased her. The train whistle shrieked, a long, mournful cry that seemed to pierce the vast, empty sky. The landscape had changed again. The gentle green hills were gone, replaced by an immensity that stole her breath. It was a raw, unfinished world, painted in shades of brown and ochre under a pale, washed-out blue sky that stretched from one edge of the earth to the other. The wind was a constant presence, a restless spirit that bent the tough grasses and stirred up dust devils that danced across the plains. There was a profound silence to the land, a quiet so deep it felt ancient and humbling. It was terrifying and beautiful all at once. This was the American West. It did not feel like a land of opportunity. It felt like a place that could swallow a person whole, leaving not even a bone behind. When the train finally ground to a halt at the Blackwood depot, the name painted in faded letters on a simple wooden sign, Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the end of the line. She stepped down onto the splintered platform, her legs unsteady, and clutched her bag. The town was little more than a single dusty street lined with a handful of false-fronted buildings. A saloon with swinging doors, a general store, a blacksmith's forge, and a livery stable. The wind whipped her skirts around her ankles and sent a fine grit of sand into her eyes. There were few people about, and those who were, a pair of cowhands. A woman in a sunbonnet glanced at her with frank, unsmiling curiosity. A stranger, new meat. She scanned the platform, her eyes searching for the stern, bearded face from the photograph. There was no one waiting. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. Had he forgotten the day? Was he delayed? She stood for what felt like an eternity, the sole passenger to disembark, a small, solitary figure in a landscape built for giants. Finally, a stooped man with a fringe of gray hair and a railroad cap shuffled out of the station house. He squinted at her. "You the one for Silas Miller?" he asked, his voice raspy. Relief washed over her. "Yes, I am. Clara Thompson. Is he here?" The station master took off his cap and scratched his head, his gaze dropping to the dusty boards of the platform. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Afraid I got some bad news for you, miss," he mumbled. "Real bad." Clara's blood ran cold. "What is it? Has something happened?" "Silas. He had an accident. Up at his place? A week ago." The man finally looked at her, his expression a mixture of pity and discomfort. "A bull got him in the barn. He's dead. Miss buried him 4 days past." The words didn't seem to make sense. Dead? It was an impossible notion. She had his letter in her bag, the paper folded and refolded until the creases were soft as cloth. She had his photograph. She had his $50, spent on a ticket to this godforsaken patch of dust. He couldn't be dead. The world seemed to tilt, the horizon blurring. All the miles she had traveled, all the hopes she had hoarded like a miser with gold coins, they all turned to ash in her mouth. She was alone, penniless, in a place where the wind never stopped blowing. The station master was still talking, saying something about it being a derned shame, but his voice was a distant buzz. Then what am I to do?" she whispered, the question swallowed by the vast silence. "That'd be my business." The voice came from behind her, low and guttural. Clara flinched and turned. A man had approached without her noticing. He was younger than the man in the photograph, but there was a coarse family resemblance in the set of his jaw. He was big, broad-shouldered, with a thick neck and hands that looked like shovels. His clothes were stained with dirt and something darker, and he smelled of sweat and sour whiskey. His eyes, small and dark, raked over her, from the bonnet on her head to the scuffed toes of her shoes, in a way that made her feel like a piece of livestock at auction. "I'm Warren Miller," he said, his tone leaving no room for pleasantries. "Silas was my brother." I'm so very sorry for your loss," Clara stammered, clutching her bag tighter. Warren grunted, a dismissive sound. "He's gone, but the arrangements he made, they ain't—" He took a step closer, crowding her. "He paid your passage, sent you money. That was family money. That makes you property of this family now." Clara stared at him, horrified. "Property? I am not a piece of property. Sir, I am a person." A humorless smirk twisted his lips. "You're a mail-order bride, ain't you? Bought and paid for. My brother's dead, but I'm here. The ranch is mine now, and so are you." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her shock. This was a different cage. Bigger, perhaps, but with a far more dangerous keeper. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "That was not our agreement. The agreement was with your brother." "My brother's in the ground," Warren snarled, his temper flaring. "You think you can just take our money and walk away? There's nowhere for you to walk to." He gestured at the empty, dusty street. "You belong with me now. You'll come to the ranch. You'll cook. You'll clean. You'll do what a wife does." The insinuation in his voice made her stomach churn. She took a step back, but her heel hit the edge of the platform. She was trapped. "I will not," she said, lifting her chin. "I would rather starve." Warren's face darkened with rage. He lunged forward and his hand clamped around her upper arm like a vice. His fingers dug into her flesh, hard and bruising. "You'll do as you're told," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "You don't have a choice." Clara cried out, a small, choked sound of pain and fear. She struggled, but his grip was iron. He started to drag her along the platform, toward a rickety wagon hitched to a tired-looking horse. Tears of frustration and terror welled in her eyes. She had run so far, only to end up in the clutches of a man far worse than the one she had fled. "Let her go!" The voice was quiet, but it cut through the air with the authority of a gunshot. It was calm, level, and held no hint of negotiation. Warren stopped, his grip tightening on Clara's arm. He turned his head slowly. Standing near the entrance to the general store was another man. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn denim and a dusty hat that shadowed his face. He wasn't powerfully built like Warren, but there was a stillness about him, a coiled tension in the way he stood. He held no weapon, but he didn't need one. His presence was enough. "This ain't your concern, Eli," Warren growled. "You're making a scene, and you're hurting the lady," the man named Eli said, his voice still quiet, still steady. He took a slow step forward. "I said, let her go." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across the dusty expanse. The wind blew, lifting a corner of Clara's bonnet. Warren's jaw worked, his small eyes glittering with malice. He was measuring the other man, weighing the cost of a fight. Whatever he saw in Eli's shadowed face, it was enough to make him hesitate. With a final vicious squeeze that made Clara gasp, Warren released her arm. He shoved her away from him, and she stumbled, catching herself against a wooden post. "She's my business." Warren spat at Eli. "My brother paid for her." "A woman ain't a sack of flour." "Warren, you can't inherit her," Eli replied, his voice flat. He didn't raise it, didn't need to. Every word landed like a stone. Warren shot Clara a look of pure hatred. "This ain't over," he snarled, then turned on his heel, stomped over to his wagon, and climbed aboard. With a savage crack of the reins, he urged the horse into a clattering trot and disappeared down the street in a cloud of dust. Clara was left standing by the post, her arm throbbing, her entire body trembling. The town seemed to have frozen, watching the little drama unfold. Now that it was over, people went back to their business, pretending they hadn't seen a thing. She was alone again, except for the quiet man who had intervened. He walked over to her, his footsteps slow and deliberate on the wooden planks. As he got closer, she could see his face more clearly. It was a landscape in itself, weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines of grief or hardship, or both. His eyes were a startlingly clear gray, the color of a winter sky, and they held a deep, unshakable sadness. He looked tired, not just in his body, but in his soul. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked. She couldn't speak, she could only nod, wrapping a hand around her bruised arm. The brief flash of safety was already fading, replaced by the crushing weight of her reality. Warren was gone for now, but he would be back. She had no money, no home, no one. Tears she had refused to shed began to slide down her cheeks. He wants to take me to his cabin," she choked out, the words tasting of shame. He thinks I belong to him." Eli's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked down the road where Warren had vanished, then back at her. He seemed uncomfortable, out of his depth. He was a man accustomed to solitude, not to weeping women. "Please," she whispered, the last of her pride crumbling. She didn't know this man, but he was the only person in this entire territory who had shown her a sliver of kindness. "Please, sir, do not let him take me. I cannot go with him. I will not." Eli looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant, hazy line of the horizon. He ran a hand over his tired face, a gesture of profound reluctance. This was not his fight. He had enough ghosts of his own to wrestle with. He didn't need to take on a stranger's troubles. "I have a place," he said finally, his voice rough, as if the words were being pulled from him against his will. "It's not much, and it's isolated. You can stay there, for one night." He looked at her then, his gray eyes clear and direct. "One night only. In the morning, you'll have to figure something else out. I ain't looking for company." The offer was grudging, a lifeline thrown by a man who wished he could have kept his hands in his pockets, but it was a lifeline nonetheless. "Thank you," Clara breathed, the words catching in her throat. "Thank you." He nodded curtly, turned, and headed toward his own wagon, a sturdy buckboard parked in front of the store. "Come on, then. It's a long ride." The journey to his homestead was made in near total silence. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels and the sigh of the wind. The landscape grew wilder, the dirt track dwindling until it was barely visible. They passed no other homesteads, no other travelers. The isolation was absolute. Clara sat rigidly on the wagon seat, her hands folded in her lap, her mind a whirlwind of fear and exhaustion. She stole glances at the man beside her. He held the reins with a quiet competence, his eyes scanning the terrain. He seemed a part of this harsh land, as weathered and silent as the rocky outcrops that dotted the plains. There was a profound loneliness about him, a wall built so high she doubted anyone had ever tried to climb it. When they finally arrived, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The homestead was nestled in a small dip, sheltered by a small stand of cottonwood trees. There was a sturdy-looking cabin, a large barn, and a series of corrals. It was all neat, well-maintained, but achingly empty. There were no chickens scratching in the yard, no curtains in the windows, no signs of life beyond the man who now brought the wagon to a halt. The cabin was one room, built of solid, hand-hewn logs. Inside, it was Spartan and impeccably clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, the hearth swept clean. There was a sturdy wooden table with 2 chairs, a bed covered with a simple wool blanket, and a dry sink. A few shelves held a small collection of books and some basic provisions. It was a man's space, functional and devoid of any softness or comfort. On the mantelpiece, above the cold fireplace, sat a single, silver-framed photograph of a smiling woman with kind eyes, his late wife, the source of the sadness in his soul. "There's water in the bucket," Eli said from the doorway, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "And jerky and biscuits in the tin on the shelf. Help yourself." Clara stood in the center of the room, feeling like an intruder. Where will you be?" "I'll sleep in the barn," he said, already turning to leave. "There's a lock on the inside of the door. Use it." He didn't wait for a reply. He simply walked away, his tall frame silhouetted against the dying light, and disappeared into the barn, closing the heavy door behind him. The sound of the bar sliding into place was a definitive, final sound. He had given her shelter, but he had also sealed himself off completely, left alone in the deepening twilight. Clara walked over to the door and slid the heavy wooden bolt across. The small act of security did little to calm the frantic beating of her heart. She was safe from Warren, at least for tonight, but she was adrift in an ocean of uncertainty. She was too exhausted and anxious to eat. She watched from the single window as the last vestiges of color bled from the sky, leaving behind a deep, velvety blackness pricked with a million impossibly bright stars. The silence of the plains pressed in on her, broken only by the mournful, yipping cries of distant coyotes. It was a lonely, wild sound, the song of a world that was indifferent to her sorrow. She didn't dare to sleep in the man's bed. It felt like a violation of his grief. Instead, she took the spare blanket he'd left on a chair, a rough, scratchy thing that smelled faintly of wood smoke and horse. She curled up on the hard floor in front of the cold hearth, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. The floorboards were unyielding against her hip and shoulder, but it was the least of her discomforts. Sleep, when it finally came, was no escape. It was a dark, turbulent water that pulled her under. She dreamed she was drowning, not in a river or a lake, but in a thick, murky substance that filled her lungs and choked her. Hands reached for her from the depths. Mr. Abernathy's soft, grasping fingers. Warren Miller's bruising grip. pulling her down, down into the suffocating darkness of her own past. She struggled toward a faint glimmer of light on the surface, but it was impossibly far away. The coyotes cried under the vast, uncaring western moon, and in her dream, it sounded like they were laughing. Clara woke to a sliver of gray light slanting through the cabin's single window. A profound ache had settled deep in her bones, a stiffness from sleeping on the hard floor that made every movement a painful negotiation. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar log walls and the scent of cold ash confusing her senses. Then the memory of the previous day crashed down upon her. The train, the dust, the news of Silas Miller's death, and the terrifying grip of his brother. Warren. The name alone was a cold knot in her stomach. She sat up, her body protesting, and looked around the quiet room. The man, Eli, was gone. The door was unbarred. Through the window, she could see him by the water pump, his back to the cabin as he worked the handle with a steady, rhythmic motion. He had offered her a roof for one night. That night was over. Panic, the familiar, icy companion of her life, began to creep in. Where could she go? Back to the town. Warren would be there, waiting. She had no money for a train ticket east, and the thought of returning to Pennsylvania, to the life she had fled, was more terrifying than any future here. A different feeling rose up to meet the panic, a stubborn, defiant spark of will. She would not be a beggar. She would not be a victim passed from one man's pity to another's cruelty. She had come west to build a new life, and even if the foundation had crumbled before she ever set foot on it, she would not simply lie down in the ruins. Pushing herself to her feet, she smoothed the wrinkles from her dress and folded the rough blanket neatly, placing it on the chair. She walked to the door and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The wind was already awake, a cool, persistent breath that carried the scent of dust and distant sagebrush. Eli heard her approach and stopped pumping, turning his head slightly. His face was grim in the morning light, his expression unreadable. He did not say good morning. He simply watched her, waiting. Mr. Eli, she began, her voice a little unsteady but clear. I thank you for your kindness last night. You saved me from a terrible situation. He gave a short, dismissive nod and turned back to the pump. Wagon's hitched. I can take you back to town after I see to the stock. No, she said, more firmly this time. The words seemed to hang in the air between them. He stopped again and faced her fully. His gray eyes narrowed. No? I cannot go back to town, she explained, her hands twisting in front of her. That man, Warren, he will be there. I have no money, sir, no place to go. I cannot ask you for more charity, but I am not afraid of work. I can cook, I can clean, I can mend, I can learn whatever I do not know. Let me earn my keep, just for a few days. Long enough to figure out what I am to do. He stared at her for a long moment, his silence a heavy, unyielding wall. I don't need a cook or a cleaner, he said flatly. I get by on my own. Everyone needs help sometime, she persisted, her desperation making her bold. You said yourself I cannot be inherited like a sack of flour. Do not treat me like one now, to be dropped off at the side of the road because I am an inconvenience. His jaw tightened. He seemed to be wrestling with himself, his duty warring with his deep-seated desire to be left alone. Finally, with a sigh of pure exasperation, he picked up the 2 heavy water buckets. The day's wasting, he muttered, and strode toward the barn without another word. It was not a yes, but it was not a no. Clara took it as the only permission she was going to get. The work was harder than anything she had ever known. Her life in Pennsylvania had been one of indoor toil, scrubbing floors, washing linens, serving meals. Here, the work was a battle against the elements. The wind was a constant thief, snatching laundry from the lines she rigged up and plastering her hair across her face. The sun was merciless, beating down on the back of her neck. The land itself was an adversary. The soil was rocky and unforgiving. making the small vegetable patch behind the cabin a place of back-breaking labor. She spent an entire morning trying to clear a patch of stubborn weeds. Her hands, accustomed to needlework and washing dishes, quickly becoming blistered and raw. Eli said nothing. He worked from sunup to sundown, a silent, efficient machine. He moved with a grim purpose, mending a stretch of broken fence that snaked across the dry, cracked earth, resetting a post that had been pushed over by a restless steer, sharpening tools in the cool darkness of the barn. He was a man who had replaced feeling with labor, who filled the empty spaces in his life with the familiar ache of physical exhaustion. Sometimes she would feel his eyes on her as she struggled. She saw him watch as she tried to split kindling with a hatchet, the blade glancing off the wood and biting into the chopping block with a useless thud. She saw him notice her wince as she carried the heavy water buckets, the handles digging into her palms, but he never offered to help. His silence was a constant judgment, a reminder that she did not belong here, that she was an awkward, useless creature of the city, ill-suited for this raw, demanding world. One afternoon, as she worked in the vegetable patch, the memory came upon her, sudden and unwelcome as a summer squall. It was the emptiness of the landscape that did it, the vast, silent horizon that mirrored the hollow ache inside her. She rested her forehead against the rough handle of the hoe, the sun hot on her back, and closed her eyes. She was back in Lancaster, in the manicured gardens behind Mr. Alistair Finch's grand house. He was not her employer. He was the son of her employer's wealthy business partner. He had come to visit for the summer, and his eyes had found her immediately. He was handsome, charming, with a quick smile and hands that were soft and clean. He spoke to her, not as a servant, but as a woman. He told her she was beautiful, that her eyes were the color of violets. He would meet her by the old well after the house was asleep, his voice a low murmur in the dark, full of promises of a different life, a life in Philadelphia, a life with him. She had believed him, young and naive, starved for a single drop of kindness. She had drunk his words like sweet wine. She had given him what he wanted, believing it was a fair trade for the love she so desperately craved. The memory shifted, the edges turning sharp and cruel. The garden was gone, replaced by a small, stuffy parlor. She had just told him. Her voice had been a whisper, full of terror and a sliver of hope. "Alistair, I am with child." The charming smile had vanished from his face, as if wiped away by an invisible hand. His eyes, which had once looked at her with such adoration, turned cold and hard, like chips of ice. He had called her a fool, a clumsy, stupid girl. He said she was trying to trap him, to ruin his life with her common predicaments. He pressed a handful of bills into her hand, enough to be rid of the problem, he'd said, and told her he never wanted to see her face again. The shame had been a physical thing, a sickness that soured her stomach and burned in her throat. She had fled Lancaster that same week, unable to face the disgrace, unable to bear the whispers. She had gone to a small, grim town where no one knew her, and there, in a charity ward that smelled of carbolic acid and despair, she had lost the child, a little girl. The midwife had said Clara never saw her. She had been too weak, too lost in a fever of grief and infection. The loss was a secret wound she carried deep inside her, a constant, silent reminder of her foolishness, of her shame, of the life she had been unable to protect. It was this shame that drove her now, this desperate need to prove that she was not a burden, that she had some worth, that she could earn her place in the world through sweat and toil, because she felt she had no right to it otherwise. A sudden noise pulled her from the memory. She opened her eyes, her cheeks wet with tears. She hadn't realized she was crying. Eli was standing not 20 feet away, holding a length of wire. He was looking at her, his expression unreadable as ever. She quickly wiped her face with the back of her dirty hand, her face flushing with humiliation at being seen in such a moment of weakness. He said nothing, simply turned and walked back toward the fence line, leaving her alone with her ghosts. Later that day, as she was returning from the well, her foot slipped on a patch of muddy ground near the overflowing stock tank. She went down hard, the full buckets flying from her hands and splashing water and mud all over her skirt. She landed on her outstretched hands, the gravel and stones of the yard digging sharply into her palms. A sharp cry of pain escaped her lips. She heard a scrape of a boot on stone and looked up. Eli had been at the barn door, and he had taken a half-step toward her, his body tensed as if to run. His right hand was outstretched, his fingers slightly curled. An instinctive, protective gesture. Their eyes met, for a fraction of a second. She saw something in his face other than cold indifference. It was concern, raw and unguarded. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He visibly checked himself, pulling his hand back and clenching it into a fist at his side. The mask of stoicism slammed back into place. "Be more careful," he said, his voice gruff. He turned and disappeared back into the shadows of the barn. Clara pushed herself up, ignoring the sting in her hands. She looked down at her palms. They were scraped raw, bleeding slightly, with dirt ground into the wounds. It was his reaction, not the fall. That hurt, that brief, aborted gesture of help was more intimate than a touch, and his withdrawal from it felt like a slap. That evening, as the shadows grew long and the sky began to bleed into sunset, they returned. She saw them from the cabin window, 3 riders cresting the small hill that overlooked the homestead. The man in the lead was Warren Miller. Eli saw them too. He straightened up from the woodpile, the axe held loosely in one hand. He did not look surprised, only weary. He had been expecting this. Clara's heart began to pound against her ribs. She stayed in the cabin, her hand pressed to her mouth, watching through the window as Warren and his 2 thuggish-looking companions rode into the yard and dismounted. "Evening, Eli," Warren called out, his voice thick with false friendliness. "Come for what's mine." Eli didn't answer right away. He just stood there by the woodpile, a solitary, unmovable figure. "She's not yours, Warren. We've had this conversation." "I figure we ain't finished it yet," Warren sneered. He and his friends began to spread out, a clear attempt to flank Eli. "My brother paid for her. That makes her a Miller debt. I'm here to collect." "She's a woman, not a debt," Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She's staying here." "Is she now?" Warren took a step forward, his hand dropping to rest on the handle of the pistol holstered at his hip. "She your woman now, Eli? Didn't take you long to replace Sarah, did it? Must be nice, having a fresh one delivered right to your door." The insult hung in the air, ugly and venomous. Clara saw Eli's knuckles turn white where he gripped the axe handle. She saw the muscle in his jaw clench. For a terrifying moment, she thought violence was inevitable. The air crackled with it. But Eli held himself in check. He took a slow, deliberate breath. "You and your friends get on your horses and ride out of here. Warren," he said, his voice low and even. "Don't make me tell you again." There was no anger in his tone. It was something far more chilling. It was a promise. Warren looked from Eli's cold gray eyes to the axe in his hand, then glanced at his 2 friends, who suddenly seemed less confident. Warren was a bully, but he wasn't a fool. He knew Eli's reputation. He knew Eli was a man who preferred to be left alone, but who was deadly when pushed. Warren hesitated, his bluster failing him. With a frustrated curse, he spat on the ground. "This ain't over," he snarled, pointing a finger at the cabin. "You hear me, girl? You belong to me. I'll be back for you." He swung himself back into his saddle, and he and his men galloped away, their departure as loud and ugly as their arrival. Eli stood watching them go, not relaxing until they were a distant speck on the horizon. Then he slowly lowered the axe and leaned it against the woodpile. He ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders slumping with a weariness that seemed to go clear to his soul. That night, The unspoken arrangement changed. Clara could not stay in the main room. In his space, after a silent, tense supper of biscuits and bacon, she gathered her meager belongings. "There is a loft, is there not?" she asked quietly. Eli just nodded, not looking at her. She climbed the rickety ladder to the small, dusty attic space. It was cramped and hot, smelling of dried herbs and old wood. But it was a space of her own, a sanctuary. As she lay down on a pile of old blankets, listening to the lonely sounds of the prairie night, she knew the one night had become something else entirely. She was no longer a guest. She was a fixture, a problem Eli hadn't solved, a presence in the empty house of his grief. A week later, the sky turned a bruised, angry purple, and the air grew thick and heavy. A storm was coming. The wind began to howl, rattling the cabin as if an angry giant were trying to shake it from its foundations. Soon, the rain came, not in drops, but in solid, driving sheets that lashed against the roof and walls. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a deafening explosion that seemed to shake the very ground, followed by brilliant, blinding flashes of lightning. Up in the loft, Clara curled into a tight ball, her hands over her ears. Every clap of thunder was like the crack of doom, every flash of lightning a glimpse into a world of violent chaos. The storm mirrored the turmoil inside her, shaking loose all her carefully buried fears. She felt small and utterly alone, a tiny, helpless thing in the face of nature's fury. Unable to bear it any longer, she crept to the ladder and descended into the cabin below. She expected to find it dark, but a single oil lamp was burning on the table, casting a small, flickering circle of warm light. Eli was sitting at the table, his back to her, staring into the lamp's flame as if he could find answers in it. He hadn't been asleep either. He must have heard the creak of the floorboards, because he turned his head. He saw her standing there, her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale with fear. He didn't say anything, but his expression softened almost imperceptibly. He stood, walked over to the stove, and began to prepare a pot of tea. He brought 2 tin cups to the table and gestured for her to sit. She obeyed, sinking into the chair opposite him. The lamplight cast deep shadows on his face, making him look older, sadder. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds the furious drumming of the rain on the roof and the gentle tap of it against the window pane. It was a strange, peaceful intimacy, a tiny island of calm in the middle of the storm. Finally, Clara found her voice. It was barely a whisper. "Why are you alone?" The question was too direct, too personal. She expected him to deflect it, to retreat back into his silence. He was quiet for so long she thought he would do just that. He stared down into his cup, tracing the rim with his thumb. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. "I wasn't always—" He looked up, and his gray eyes met hers across the small table. "I had a wife. Her name was Sarah." He gestured with his chin toward the photograph on the mantelpiece. "We were married for 5 years. We built this place together. These walls, these were our walls." He took a sip of tea, his hand unsteady. 3 years ago, she was expecting our first child, a son. We had the name all picked out, Samuel. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a sad, fleeting thing. The birth was difficult. The doctor came out from town, but there was nothing he could do. I lost them both on the same night, Sarah and the boy. He fell silent, the story told. The simple, brutal facts of his loss filled the small cabin, a presence more real and powerful than the storm raging outside. Clara's heart ached for him, for the unimaginable weight of the grief he carried alone. All his coldness, his distance, his desire for solitude. It all made sense now. She felt a tear slide down her own cheek, a tear of pure, unselfish empathy for this broken man. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft with a feeling she couldn't name. "You shouldn't be alone like this," she whispered. As she spoke, she reached out, a simple, unconscious gesture of comfort. Her fingers brushed against the back of his hand where it rested on the table. The contact was like a bolt of lightning, more shocking than the storm outside. A tremor ran through him. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with a look of stunned panic. It was the touch of a living, breathing woman, warm and real, and it was a language his body had forgotten how to speak. He snatched his hand back as if he had been burned, the chair scraping loudly against the floor as he pushed himself away from the table. He stood there for a heart-stopping second, his chest rising and falling rapidly, looking at her as if she were a ghost. Without a word, he turned and walked stiffly to the cabin door, unbarred it, and stepped out into the raging storm, closing the door firmly behind him. Clara was left alone in the lamplight, her hand still tingling from the brief, forbidden touch. The rain beat against the windows, and the wind howled his name, but the silence he left behind was the loudest sound of all. The days after the storm settled into a fragile, unspoken truce. Eli did not tell Clara to leave, and she did not ask if she could stay. The question hung in the air between them, as palpable and persistent as the dust that settled on every surface. He retreated even further into his shell, his silence becoming a fortress. He would leave for the barn before she rose and return to the cabin long after she had retired to the attic loft, taking his meals alone, a solitary shadow in his own home. Clara, in turn, answered his silence with action. She could not bridge the chasm between them with words, so she tried to fill it with work. She was determined to transform herself from a burden into a necessity. She rose with the first hint of dawn, her body now accustomed to the hard work, her hands calloused but capable. She found a rhythm in the chores, a sense of purpose in the endless cycle of labor. She started with the house. It was a clean space, but it was a shell, lacking a soul. Clara began to breathe life back into it, one small act at a time. She found a sack of flour and a tin of yeast in the pantry and, after several failed, brick-like attempts, managed to bake a decent loaf of bread. The warm, yeasty scent that filled the cabin was the first truly comforting smell the place had held since her arrival. When Eli came in that evening, he stopped dead in the doorway, his nostrils flaring slightly. He looked at the golden-brown loaf sitting on the table, then looked at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and something else she couldn't decipher. He ate 2 thick slices without a word, but she counted it as a victory. She took on his mending, her fingers, once clumsy with farm tools, finding their old dexterity with a needle and thread. She patched his denim trousers and restitched the cuffs of his worn work shirts with tiny, neat stitches that were nearly invisible. She was not just repairing the cloth. She was trying to mend the frayed edges of their strange, shared existence. Her courage grew, and she began venturing into the barn, Eli's sacred territory. At first, she only went to fetch eggs from the 2 lone hens that roosted there, but soon she found herself drawn to the horses. There were 3 of them, Eli's steady buckskin, a spare mare, and a young, flighty gelding. She started by bringing them water, then handfuls of sweet grass. She learned to speak to them in a low, soothing voice, the way she had seen Eli do. She found a brush and began to groom them, her steady, rhythmic strokes calming both the animals and the tremor of anxiety in her own heart. The horses, unlike the man who owned them, did not judge her past or question her presence. They simply accepted her quiet care. Eli watched it all from a distance. He would see the neatly darned sock as he pulled on his boots, or notice the horses' coats gleaming in the sun, and a muscle in his jaw would tighten. Her presence was an undeniable fact, a persistent warmth seeping into the cold corners of his life. It was an echo of a time when this homestead had been alive with purpose and love, a time before the silence had taken root, and every echo was a fresh torment, a betrayal of the grief he felt he was sworn to carry. He was haunted by the memory of his wife, Sarah, and this new woman's quiet industry felt like an attempt to erase her, to scrub away her ghost with the scent of fresh bread and the sound of a soft voice in the barn. So he held on to his silence, his guilt a shield against the warmth she offered. The fragile peace of their isolation was shattered on a trip to Blackwood. The pantry was low on salt and coffee, and one of the wagon wheels needed a new pin from the blacksmith. Eli had announced his intention to go at dawn, clearly intending to go alone. But Clara, seeing the last of her thread was gone, insisted she must come as well. He argued, his voice clipped and impatient. "It is not a place for you." But she stood her ground, her need for the small spool of thread a stand-in for her larger need not to be hidden away like a shameful secret. He finally relented with a sigh of grim resignation. The ride to town was tense and silent. When they arrived, Clara felt the change in atmosphere immediately. It was as if their wagon carried its own private thundercloud. Eyes followed them down the dusty street. Women, gathered in pairs on the boardwalk, stopped their conversations to stare, their whispers buzzing like flies as Clara passed. Men tipping their hats to Eli did so with a knowing, speculative smirk. In the general store, the air grew thick with unspoken judgment. Mrs. Peterson, the proprietor's wife, served them with a pinched expression, her movement stiff with disapproval. Clara felt her cheeks burn. The shame as hot and real as a brand. She was the scarlet woman, the live-in housekeeper, the widower's whore. They had tried her and convicted her without a single word being spoken. The verdict was delivered in person 2 days later, in the form of Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife. She arrived in a polished black buggy, a small, bird-like woman swathed in gray silk, her face set in an expression of pious concern. Clara was in the yard, hanging laundry. When the buggy pulled up, Eli was miles away, mending the far fences. She was alone. "Good afternoon, my dear," Mrs. Gable said, her smile not reaching her cold, assessing eyes. "I am Martha Gable. My husband is the reverend at the church in town. I was just passing by and thought I might stop in to see how you were settling." Clara, her hands still damp, nervously wiped them on her apron. "That is very kind of you, ma'am. Please, come inside." She led the woman into the cabin. Mrs. Gable's eyes darted everywhere, taking in the clean floor, the mended curtains Clara had fashioned from an old sheet, the wildflowers she had placed in a jar on the table. "You have made the place quite tidy," Mrs. Gable observed, her tone implying that this was a surprise. She sat delicately on the edge of a chair, refusing Clara's offer of water. "Mr. Miller is a good man," she began, folding her gloved hands in her lap. "A good, Christian man. His loss was a tragedy that struck our whole community. To lose a wife and child in one night, it is a sorrow few men could endure." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the small room. "He has borne his grief with admirable solitude these past 3 years." Clara said nothing, merely nodding, her stomach beginning to churn. "Which is why, my dear," Mrs. Gable continued, her voice dropping to a confidential, conspiratorial whisper, "the town is so concerned. A young woman, alone and unmarried, living so far out on a widower's homestead. You must understand, child, how such a thing looks. People have started to talk, vicious talk. It sullies your reputation, of course, but more importantly, it casts a shadow on the good name of a grieving man." Every word was a carefully aimed dart, dipped in the poison of self-righteous pity. "I am only earning my keep, ma'am," Clara said, her voice small. "I have nowhere else to go." Of course," Mrs. Gable said, waving a dismissive hand. "Your circumstances are most unfortunate, but you must think of what is proper, what is righteous in the eyes of the Lord. An arrangement like this, it cannot continue. It is a source of temptation for him and a source of ruin for you. I am here as a friend, child, to advise you to leave. Go to a bigger town, perhaps, Find proper work as a domestic in a family home. It is for your own good. You must go before things get worse." The visit was short, but the woman's presence lingered long after her buggy had disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind a toxic residue of shame. Clara stood in the center of the cabin, the tidy space now feeling like a stage upon which her disgrace was being performed. Mrs. Gable's words had confirmed her deepest fears. She was a burden. She was a stain on Eli's life, a temptation, a source of gossip that was tarnishing the memory of the sainted Sarah. The isolation of the homestead, which had once felt like a shield, now felt like a cage she had willingly entered, trapping not only herself, but Eli as well. Her turmoil deepened a few days later. She was tasked with cleaning the small set of drawers where Eli kept his papers. It was a job she undertook with meticulous care, wanting to prove her worthiness. In the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a stack of old ledgers, her fingers brushed against a small, carved wooden box. It was not locked. Hesitantly, driven by a curiosity she could not quell, she lifted the lid. Inside lay a bundle of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. The handwriting was Eli's, strong and clear, but they were not addressed to anyone who could receive them. The first one began, "My dearest Sarah." Her heart pounded. She knew she should close the box, that this was a violation of a sacred, private grief, but she couldn't. She untied the ribbon and carefully unfolded the first letter. It was dated just a month after his wife's death. "My dearest Sarah," it read, "The silence in this house is a living thing. I hear your footsteps on the floorboards when there is no one there. I turn to tell you about the broken fence, and the words die in my throat because you are not sitting in your chair. The sun came up this morning, and I hated it for daring to rise on a world that you are not in. They tell me time will heal, but every second that passes is just another second that you are gone. How am I to live through a lifetime of them?" Clara's hands trembled as she read on. Letter after letter, written over the course of 3 years, poured out a litany of sorrow. They were filled with a longing so profound, so raw, it felt like a physical wound. He wrote to her about the ranch, about the weather, about the mundane details of his empty life. All of it threaded through with an aching, desperate love. He was not just mourning her. He was still actively in love with her ghost. Tears streamed down Clara's face as she read. She was not just an intruder in his house. She was an intruder in this epic love story. How could her own messy, shameful existence ever share a space with a love so pure and a grief so vast? She carefully retied the ribbon, placed the letters back in the box, and shut the drawer, her heart heavy with a new and crushing understanding of the man who slept in the barn. She was a weed in the garden of his sorrow. That night, she was a ghost herself, moving through the motions of preparing the evening meal, her mind lost in the pages of Eli's letters. She was distracted, her movements clumsy. She leaned over the hearth to stir a pot of stew, her thoughts 1,000 miles away. She didn't notice the hem of her worn calico skirt swinging just a little too close to the open flame. The first sign was a sudden, intense heat against her leg, followed by the acrid smell of burning wool. She looked down and screamed. A bright orange tongue of fire was licking its way up her skirt, growing with terrifying speed. Panic seized her. She slapped at the flames with her hands, but it only seemed to make them leap higher. She stumbled backward, tripping over the hearthstone and falling hard, her cry a raw sound of pure terror. Eli was outside, splitting the last of the day's firewood. He heard the scream and moved without thinking. He burst through the cabin door to see her on the floor, a horrifying blossom of fire consuming her dress. His reaction was immediate, instinctual, and brutally efficient. He snatched the bucket of water from the dry sink and threw its contents over her, dousing the flames in a great hissing cloud of steam and smoke. The sudden cold shock of the water was as jarring as the fire. Clara was left gasping on the floor, soaked and shivering, the reek of burned cloth filling her lungs. The danger was over. But the aftermath was a new kind of horror. Her skirt was a blackened, ruined mess. In her fall, the shoulder of her blouse had torn, and the rough fabric had scraped against her back. Eli rushed to her side, his face pale and grim beneath its weathered tan. "Clara, are you hurt?" He knelt beside her, his hands hovering, wanting to check for injuries. "Let me see," he said, his voice rough with adrenaline. She scrambled away from him, trying to pull the tattered remains of her clothing around herself. "No, please do not look," she cried, her voice choked with humiliation. The fire was one thing, but this exposure, this raw vulnerability in front of him, was unbearable. But he was no longer the distant, cold man she knew. He was a man driven by a singular, urgent purpose, to help. He moved behind her, his movements gentle but firm. "Hush now," he murmured, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I need to see the burn. Just be still." She froze, too shocked and pained to resist. He carefully, tenderly, pulled aside the torn fabric of her blouse. She flinched as the cool night air hit her skin, a raw patch of red along her shoulder blade where the fire had kissed her. She could feel his breath, warm against her neck. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for a rough touch, a clinical assessment, anything but the profound gentleness that came next. His fingers, calloused and rough from years of hard labor, touched her skin with the lightness of a feather. He examined the burn, his touch careful and deliberate. Then he stood, retrieved a clean cloth and a jar of salve from a shelf, and knelt behind her again. He dipped the cloth in fresh, cool water and began to clean the wound, his motions incredibly soft. Clara trembled, not from the pain, but from the touch itself. It was a touch devoid of demand, of ownership, of anything but simple, unadorned care. It was so foreign, so deeply unexpected, that it broke something open inside her. A single, ragged sob escaped her lips. "No man has ever touched me without wanting something," she whispered into the smoky air, the words a confession of a lifetime of hurts, of Alistair Finch's promises and Warren Miller's threats. Eli's hand stilled for a second. He was so close she could feel the warmth of his body. He resumed his gentle work, applying the cool, soothing salve to her burn. When he spoke, his voice was a low, soft murmur right beside her ear. "That is not what I want." The words were a balm, more healing than the salve on her skin. They were a denial of every ugly expectation she had ever had of men, a quiet, powerful declaration of his own character. She slowly turned her head, looking over her shoulder at him. His face was inches from hers, his gray eyes, illuminated by the flickering firelight, holding hers with a startling intensity. The air grew thick, charged with all the things they had never said. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the sorrow, the guilt, and something new, something warm and frightening that was directed at her. The world seemed to shrink to the small space between them. Her breath caught in her throat. His gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. He leaned in almost imperceptibly, a magnetic pull drawing them closer. Then, as if breaking a spell, he pulled back. He finished tending to the wound, his movements suddenly clipped and efficient. He stood up abruptly, his hands clenched at his sides. As he turned away from the firelight, Clara saw it, a fine, uncontrollable tremble in his hands. He had felt it too. He walked to the door and left without another word, disappearing into the darkness of the night, seeking refuge in the cold solitude of the barn. Clara was left shivering on the floor, her skin stinging from the burn, her heart aching with the terrifying, impossible hope of a kindness she never thought she would know. The tender moment by the fire had shattered the fragile peace between them, replacing the comfortable silence of strangers with the excruciating awkwardness of two people who had seen a glimpse of something in each other they were not prepared to face. In the days that followed, Clara was consumed by a profound and agonizing shame. The burn on her back was a constant, searing reminder not of the fire, but of his touch, of the gentleness she felt she had not earned, and of the raw vulnerability she had shown him. She began to avoid him with a meticulous, desperate energy. She rose before the sun, long before she could hear him stirring in the barn, and completed her morning chores in the cold, gray light of dawn. She took her meals standing by the stove while he was out, ensuring she was finished and the cabin was empty by the time he came in for his own silent repast. When their paths did cross in the yard or the barn, she would keep her eyes fixed on the ground, her words clipped and functional, offering only the barest necessary information about a leaking water bucket or a low supply of oats. She built a wall of work and averted glances, hoping it was high enough to hide the tremor in her hands whenever he came near. Eli was not a man to miss such a change. He had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythm of her presence, the scent of baking bread, the soft sound of her voice as she spoke to the horses. Now. The silence that returned to the homestead was different. It was not the empty, grief-stricken silence he had cultivated for 3 years. It was a strained, deliberate silence, an absence that was more powerful than her presence had ever been. He saw the way she flinched when he entered the barn, the way her shoulders tensed when he walked past the garden. He saw the new, haunted look in her eyes. He did not understand it. He had seen her fear and her pain, and he had tried to offer a moment's comfort. He had spoken the truth, that he wanted nothing from her but to ease her hurt. He thought it would be a reassurance. Instead, it seemed to have terrified her more than Warren Miller's threats. His own conflict deepened. The ghost of his wife, Sarah, whispered accusations in his ear, telling him he was betraying her memory with every thought he gave this new woman. But another, quieter voice, one he had not heard in years, wondered what life would be like if the silence was broken not by grief, but by a shared glance, a quiet word. Her retreat from him created a hollow ache in his chest, a loneliness he had thought he was immune to. The tension stretched for nearly a week, thin and taut as a wire. Clara felt as if she were slowly suffocating. Mrs. Gable's pious warnings and the memory of Eli's letters to his dead wife played on a constant loop in her mind. She was a trespasser, a contaminant in this house of sacred sorrow. His kindness by the fire had not been an invitation. It had been a final and terrible act of pity. She could not bear it any longer. She found him late one afternoon by the corrals, mending a leather strap on a bridle. He was so absorbed in his work, his strong, calloused fingers moving with practiced ease, that he did not hear her approach. She stood for a moment, watching him, her heart a wild, frantic bird in her chest. "Mr. Eli," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked up, his expression guarded. He had not been Mr. Eli to her since the first day. The return to formality was a clear signal of the distance she had placed between them. She twisted the fabric of her apron in her hands, her gaze fixed on a loose stone by his boot. "I believe it is time for me to leave," she said, the words tasting like ash. "I have been a burden on you for too long. Mrs. Gable was right. My being here, it is not proper. It is causing you trouble in town, and I cannot stay where I am not wanted." Eli put down the bridle and rose slowly to his full height. He looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face, trying to read the truth behind her stilted, formal words. The wind lifted a stray strand of her hair and blew it across her cheek. He thought of all the empty days before she had come, the silent meals, the cold hearth. He thought of the suffocating loneliness he had mistaken for peace. He took a step closer, and she flinched, her eyes still on the ground. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it held a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very air between them. "I do not want you to—" Clara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. Of all the things she had expected him to say, a polite agreement, a grudging offer to take her to town, even a simple, silent nod. It was not that. The 3 simple words dismantled her defenses. leaving her utterly exposed. Before she could find her voice to reply, a new sound cut through the air, a violent crack of splintering wood from the far pasture, followed by the high, terrified whinny of a horse. Eli's head turned in an instant, his body tensing. "Stay here," he commanded, already moving toward the barn at a run. But Clara did not stay. Something had shifted in that single moment. Some barrier had broken. He did not want her to go. The thought was a revelation, a spark of impossible warmth. As he emerged from the barn, leading his saddled buckskin, he saw her standing by the cabin door, her face pale but resolute. A hard, driving rain had begun to fall, plastering her hair to her face. "I said stay here," he yelled over the rising wind. "You might need help," she yelled back, her voice thin against the storm's fury. There was no time to argue. With a curse, he swung himself into the saddle and galloped toward the broken fence, the rain already soaking him to the skin. A moment later, Clara, her skirts hitched up, was running after him, her worn shoes slipping in the rapidly forming mud. The scene at the far pasture was one of chaos. A section of the fence had been shattered. The thick posts snapped like twigs. A wild horse, a magnificent black stallion with terror in its eyes, was thrashing in the mud just inside the break. Its leg was tangled in a mess of barbed wire, and with every frantic movement, it only ensnared itself further, the barbs tearing at its flesh. Lightning split the sky, and in the stark, blue-white flash, Clara saw the blood streaming down the animal's leg. Eli was trying to approach, speaking in a low, calming voice. But the stallion was too panicked. It reared, its powerful hooves flailing dangerously, its eyes rolling back in its head. It was a creature of pure, mindless terror. Clara slowed her approach, her heart pounding. She saw the danger, but she also saw the animal's agony. While Eli moved to the horse's head, trying to get a rope around its neck to control it, she began to circle around, moving slowly, deliberately, her body low to the ground. The rain was a cold, blinding sheet, but she never took her eyes off the terrified horse. "Easy now," she murmured, her voice soft but clear, somehow carrying over the wind and rain. "Easy, boy. No one is going to hurt you." The stallion's ears twitched. It stopped its frantic struggle for a moment, its wide, wild eyes fixing on her. Eli froze, watching in stunned disbelief. Clara continued to speak, her tone a steady, hypnotic murmur. She sang a fragment of an old lullaby her mother used to sing, a simple, gentle tune. She got closer, one slow, careful step at a time, until she was just a few feet from the animal's trembling flank. She held out a hand, palm open, a gesture of peace. "Just let us help you," she whispered. Miraculously, the great horse seemed to respond. The frantic energy began to drain out of it, replaced by a quivering exhaustion. It stood still, its sides heaving, its gaze locked on her. It was the opening Eli needed. He moved in swiftly, his knife flashing as he cut the thickest wires, then worked patiently to untangle the rest. It was a long, painstaking process, and all the while, Clara stayed by the stallion's side, stroking its neck, her voice a constant, soothing presence. Finally, the last wire came free. The stallion, exhausted and bleeding but no longer trapped, took a stumbling step, then another. It looked at Clara for a long moment, a strange, silent communication passing between them. Then, with a snort, it turned and galloped off into the stormy darkness, a free, wild thing once more. Eli stood in the pouring rain, the wire cutters hanging from his hand. He was staring at Clara, not with surprise, but with a look of raw, unguarded admiration. He had seen her as a victim, a burden, a temptation, a fragile creature from another world. But in that moment, ankle deep in mud, soaked to the bone, with the rain dripping from her chin, he saw her for what she truly was. She was strong. She was brave. She possessed a quiet, powerful grace that had soothed a wild, terrified beast. He had seen strength in his life, the brute strength of men and the enduring strength of the land. But this was something else entirely. It was the strength of a survivor. They walked back to the cabin in silence, the storm beginning to abate. They were both drenched, chilled to the bone. Inside, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. Eli added more wood, and soon a cheerful blaze was crackling in the hearth, chasing the cold from the room. They stood on opposite sides of the fire, dripping onto the floorboards, the awkwardness returning, but changed now, charged with the memory of what they had just shared. Clara shivered, and Eli turned, pulling a thick wool blanket from his bed and draping it around her shoulders. His fingers brushed her neck, a brief, accidental contact that sent a jolt through them both. They sat before the fire, sharing a pot of strong, hot coffee, the steam warming their faces. The world was reduced to this one small, warm room, the sound of the dying rain tapping on the roof, a soft, gentle rhythm. "I do not know how you did that," Eli said, his voice low. "With the horse." Clara looked into the flames, a sad smile touching her lips. "Frightened things. Sometimes they just need a quiet voice, not a rope." They fell silent again. The shared danger had stripped away their pretenses, leaving them raw and open. Clara knew this was the moment. She could either retreat back into her shame, or she could lay it all down, here, in the safety of the firelight. She took a deep breath. "The man back in Pennsylvania," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "The one I fled from. He was not my employer, not truly." Eli said nothing, but his attention was absolute. He turned his body slightly toward her, an invitation to continue. "His name was Alistair. He was handsome and wealthy, and he said he loved me." The words were hard, tasting of old lies. "He promised me a new life, away from the scrubbing and the servitude. I was young and foolish, and I believed him. I gave him everything." She paused, gathering her courage. "When I told him I was with child, he called me a whore and a fool. He gave me money and told me to disappear, and I did. I ran, but I lost the baby. A little girl. I was sick for a long time afterward. The shame of it. It felt like a sickness that would never leave." She finally risked a glance at him. He was listening with a profound, unwavering stillness, his face etched with a deep, sorrowful empathy. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet understanding. "That is why I answered your brother's advertisement," she finished, her voice a whisper. "I wanted to go somewhere so far away that my past could not find me. I wanted to be a respectable wife to a decent man. I just wanted a chance to be someone else, someone clean." Tears she hadn't known were there began to slide down her cheeks, hot against her cold skin. She had finally spoken the truth, the whole ugly, shameful story. She waited for the disgust, the pity, the inevitable rejection. Eli was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion she could not name. "None of that," he said slowly, deliberately. "Changes what I see when I look at you now." His words were a gift, an absolution she had never dreamed of receiving. He did not see the soiled, foolish girl from Lancaster. He saw the woman who had calmed a wild horse, who baked bread in his cold kitchen, who had faced down his grief and her own fear, and was still, somehow, standing. As if in a dream, he reached out and took her hand. His touch was warm and firm, his calloused thumb gently stroking the back of her wrist. The simple contact was overwhelmingly intimate, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them. Slowly, hesitantly, Clara leaned into him, resting her head against his solid shoulder. He did not pull away. Instead, his arm came around her, holding her gently. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the fire crackle and the last of the rainfall. The intimacy grew in the silence, a fragile, beautiful thing. He shifted slightly, and his free hand came up to her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, then brushing the damp hair from her cheek. His touch was a question, a reverence, a discovery. She looked up at him, her heart aching with a feeling so new and terrifying it had no name. "I have never wanted to be seen this way," she whispered, the words a confession of her deepest fear and her most profound desire, to be seen, truly and completely, and not be found wanting. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips. The world seemed to stop, to hold its breath. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his gray eyes asking a final, silent question. And then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, not at first. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, a hesitant exploration. It was gentle and searching, as if he were learning the shape of her, the taste of her, the reality of her. She responded in kind, her own fears melting away in the simple, breathtaking warmth of his mouth on hers. Then the kiss deepened, the hesitation giving way to a flood of pent-up longing, of shared sorrow and a desperate, burgeoning hope. It was a kiss that spoke of lonely nights and silent grief, of a connection forged in a storm and sealed in the quiet comfort of a fire. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her side. That night, for the first time, he did not go to the barn. He bolted the cabin door and added another log to the fire. They did not speak. Words were no longer necessary. They lay down on the single bed, still fully clothed, and pulled the blankets over them. He gathered her into his arms, and she curled against him, her head tucked beneath his chin. They lay entangled, two survivors finding refuge in each other, listening to the wind howl outside, a sound that no longer felt like a threat, but like a lullaby for a world that was, against all odds, beginning anew. The world inside the small cabin had become a universe unto itself, a fragile bubble of quiet understanding and nascent affection. The nights they spent together, chastely entangled under the blankets, were a silent conversation, a language spoken in the warmth of another's body, the steady rhythm of another's breath. By day, the awkwardness that had once defined their interactions had softened into a gentle, shy dance. A shared glance over the dinner table, the brief touch of his fingers against hers as he passed her a cup of coffee, the small, almost imperceptible smile he gave her when she managed to coax a laugh from him with a story. These were the small bricks with which they were building something new in the ruins of their old lives. But outside their isolated homestead, in the dusty, judgmental heart of Blackwood, another story was being built, a story of a different kind, ugly and twisted, and its chief architect was Warren Miller. Warren, denied his prize by force, now turned to the more insidious weapon of gossip. In the smoky confines of the town saloon, fueled by cheap whiskey and a festering sense of grievance, he painted a lurid tale for any who would listen. He spoke of his dead brother's $50, the price paid for a piece of property. He described how the grieving, lonely Eli Wade had stolen his inheritance, taking the woman for himself. He seasoned his story with vile insinuations, calling Clara a cunning harlot who had played one man against the other, a woman of loose morals who had moved into a widower's bed before his sainted wife was even cold in the ground. The poison spread quickly through the small, tightly knit community. A town starved for drama feasted on the scandal. The whispers that had followed Clara before now grew into a chorus of condemnation. She was no longer just an object of suspicion. She was a proven sinner, the whore of Blackwood Creek. The change was palpable on their next necessary trip to town. The stares were no longer curious, but hostile. Women pulled their children closer as Clara passed, turning their backs with theatrical disdain. In the general store, Mrs. Peterson served them in stony silence, slapping their goods onto the counter as if they were contaminated. the blacksmith, a man Eli had known for years, could barely meet his eye. The entire town had become a jury, and the verdict had already been rendered. Clara felt the weight of their judgment like a physical blow, her cheeks burning with a shame that was no longer just her own, but theirs. A shame that Eli was now forced to share. He felt it too. His face was a stoic mask, but she saw the tightening of his jaw, the hard, cold anger in his eyes as he guided the wagon through the gauntlet of hostile glares. He was a proud, private man, and this public disgrace was a violation he could not abide. Warren, emboldened by his success, decided to escalate his campaign. He rode out to the next county and found the circuit judge, a man named Abernathy, who was making his biannual rounds. Warren presented his case not as a personal vendetta, but as a legal matter. He had a contract, he claimed, a mail-order bride agreement paid for with family funds. This woman, Clara Thompson, was legally his chattel, stolen from him by Eli Wade. He demanded the judge intervene, to uphold the law and return his property. Judge Abernathy was a weary, pragmatic man who had seen every form of human ugliness the territory had to offer. He was more interested in maintaining a semblance of order than in dispensing true justice. A dispute over a mail-order bride was a messy, unpleasant affair, but Warren was persistent and had the backing of a vocal portion of the town. Reluctantly, the judge agreed to ride to Blackwood to investigate the matter. His arrival was a public spectacle. He set up his inquiry not in a proper office, but in the saloon, the very heart of the town's gossip. The room was packed, the air thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and righteous indignation. Clara stood beside Eli, her hands trembling, feeling like an animal in a cage, surrounded by a jeering crowd. Warren, clean-shaven and wearing his best shirt, stood before the judge and spun his web of lies with smug confidence. He spoke of his brother's honorable intentions and the money he had spent. He painted Clara as a duplicitous woman who had taken their money and then, upon finding her intended groom dead, had immediately seduced the nearest available man. She was promised to the Miller family, Your Honor, Warren concluded, his voice ringing with false sincerity. She belongs at the Miller Ranch. Eli Wade has no claim on her. He stole her, plain and simple. Then the judge turned his tired, disinterested eyes on Clara. Well, girl, what do you have to say for yourself? Clara opened her mouth, but no words came out. The hostile faces blurred before her. She saw Mrs. Gable in the crowd, her expression one of cold satisfaction. She saw the smirking men and the condemning eyes of the women. All her old shame, the ghosts of Alistair and the lost child, rose up to choke her. She was what they said she was, a fallen woman, a source of trouble, a piece of property to be fought over. Her silence was taken as an admission of guilt. Eli stepped forward, his voice a low, dangerous rumble in the suddenly quiet room. She has nothing to say to you, or to any of them, he said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd with contempt. This is not a matter of property. This is a woman's life. She came here to marry my neighbor and found herself alone and threatened. I offered her shelter. That is the beginning and the end of the story. She is living in your house, Wade, the judge said flatly. In your bed, I imagine. What happens in my house is my business, Eli retorted, his temper fraying. She is a free woman. She can stay or go as she pleases. Warren has no more claim on her than he does on the moon in the sky. The judge sighed. Rubbing his temples, he had no real authority to force the issue, but the pressure from the town was immense. He rendered his verdict with a weary wave of his hand. This is an unseemly and immoral situation. The woman was contracted to the Miller family. While I cannot force her to go with you, Warren, I find your claim has merit, and I find your living arrangement, Wade, to be a disgrace to this community. I suggest you rectify it immediately. The ride back to the homestead was a journey through a wasteland of humiliation. Clara sat beside Eli, staring blindly at the passing landscape. the judge's words echoing in her mind. A disgrace. An immoral situation. She had brought this down on him. She had taken his kindness and repaid him by making him an outcast in his own community. That evening, they sat before the fire, the space between them once again a chasm of unspoken misery. Clara knew what she had to do. She had to leave. It was the only way to restore his good name, to free him from the scandal she had brought to his door. But before she could speak the words, Eli looked at her, his face carved with a fierce, protective tenderness that stole her breath. "Marry me, Clara," he said, his voice low and urgent. She stared at him, her mind unable to process the words. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated, leaning forward. "Give me your hand. Let me give you my name. We will go before the judge tomorrow. As my wife, no one can touch you. Warren will have no claim. The town will have to be silent. It is the only way to protect you." The blood drained from her face. Protect her. Give her his name. The words were meant to be a comfort, a shield. But to her, they sounded like the clanging of a prison door. It was the same language of ownership, spoken in a kinder voice. First, she was to be Silas Miller's property. Then Warren had insisted she was his. Even Alistair, with his sweet lies, had spoken of taking her away, of making her his. And now Eli, the one man who had shown her true gentleness, was offering to do the same, to claim her, to put his name on her as a brand to ward off other men. The old, deep-seated terror of being possessed, of being a thing that belonged to a man, rose up in her, bitter and blinding. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I cannot." Eli looked stunned, hurt. "Clara, it is the only way. I am not doing this out of obligation. I am doing this because—" He struggled for the words, the admission costing his proud, private heart a great deal. "Because I care for you. I want you here, with me." "As your property?" she cried, the words tearing out of her, raw and wounded. "Is that what this is? Another contract to make me safe? Another man to own me, to hide me away behind his name? I will not be claimed, not by Warren, not by the town, not even by you." "That is not what I am saying," he said, his voice rising in frustration. "I am trying to help you." "I do not want that kind of help," she retorted, scrambling to her feet. "I would rather face them all alone than be passed from one man's hand to another like a deed to a piece of land." The argument was a clash of two different pains, his desire to protect clashing with her desperate need to be free. He saw her rejection of his offer as a rejection of him, and she saw his offer as a negation of her very self. Blinded by tears and a terror she could not articulate, Clara fled. She grabbed her thin shawl and ran from the cabin, out into the cold, dark night. She ran without thinking, her only instinct to escape the suffocating kindness that felt so much like a cage. She ran all the way back to town, gasping for breath, her side aching. She found herself standing before the small white church, its steeple a dark finger pointing at the uncaring stars. It was a house of God, a place of sanctuary. Surely here she could find a moment of peace, a kind word. She went to the parsonage next door and knocked, her knuckles rapping weakly against the wood. The door opened, and Mrs. Gable stood there, holding a lamp, her face a mask of cold surprise. "Child, what are you doing here at this hour?" "Please, ma'am," Clara begged, her voice ragged. "There was an argument. I had to leave. Could I just sit in the church for a while? Or sleep on a pew? Just until morning. Please." Mrs. Gable's expression hardened, her Christian charity evaporating in the face of this messy, real-life sinner standing on her doorstep. "The house of God is a place for the righteous, my dear," she said, her voice like chips of ice. "Not for those who invite scandal upon themselves and upon good men. You have made your bed, Miss Thompson. I suggest you find your way back to it." With that, She closed the door in Clara's face, plunging her back into darkness. The rejection was absolute. The final door slammed shut. She was truly, utterly alone, numb with despair. She stumbled away, seeking the anonymous shadows of the livery stable to hide herself until dawn. She huddled in the darkness, the smell of hay and manure thick in the air. She was just beginning to succumb to a cold, exhausted stupor when she heard the crunch of boots outside. The stable door creaked open, and 3 figures were silhouetted against the moonlight. "Well, well, look what we have here," a familiar, gravelly voice sneered. It was one of Warren's men. "Got lost from your keeper, little lady." Clara's blood ran cold. She scrambled to her feet, backing away into the deeper shadows of a horse stall. It was Warren and his 2 cronies. They had been in the saloon and must have seen her run through town. "I told you I'd be back for what's mine," Warren growled, advancing on her, a predatory grin on his face. "Looks like your protector threw you out. Or did you finally realize who you really belong to?" They began to circle her, cutting off her escape. Panic, sharp and blinding, clawed at her throat. She looked from one leering face to another. There would be no escape. This was the end. And then, another sound. The thunder of hoofbeats. A horse ridden hard into town, coming to a skidding halt outside the stable. Eli burst through the doorway, his face a mask of cold, deadly fury. He had followed her. He had known she would be in danger. His eyes took in the scene in an instant. Clara, trapped and terrified, and the 3 men closing in on her. "Get away from her," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. Warren laughed. "Or what? Wade. It is 3 against 1. Eli didn't waste another word. He moved with a speed and violence that was terrifying. He drove his fist into the face of the first man, who crumpled to the ground with a grunt. The second man pulled a knife, but Eli was already on him, grabbing his wrist and twisting it until the man shrieked and the knife clattered to the floor. Warren, momentarily stunned, charged at Eli like a bull. The 2 men crashed together, a brutal explosion of desperate violence. It was not a clean fight. It was a brawl, full of grunts and curses and the sickening thud of fists against flesh. They slammed against the wooden stalls, sending horses into a panic. Eli was a fierce fighter, driven by a protective rage that made him heedless of his own safety. He took a heavy blow to the ribs that made him gasp, and the hilt of a pistol caught him on the forehead, opening a deep gush. But in the end, his cold fury won out. He landed a series of brutal, punishing blows that sent Warren staggering backward, his face a bloody mess. Warren stared at Eli, at the blood streaming down his face and the raw, murderous look in his eyes, and for the first time, he was truly afraid. He and his men scrambled out of the stable and disappeared into the night. Eli stood there for a moment, his chest heaving, his body battered and bruised. Then he turned to Clara. She rushed to him, her hands fluttering near his bleeding face. "You are hurt," she whispered, her voice trembling. He just looked at her, his anger draining away, leaving only a profound, aching tenderness. "Let's go home," he said. Back at the cabin, she gently pushed him into a chair by the fire. She brought a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. Her hands, which had trembled with fear just an hour before, were now steady and sure. She cleaned the cut on his forehead, her touch as gentle as his had been on her burned skin. She wiped the blood from his split lip, her heart aching with a love so powerful it felt like it would break her open. He had fought for her, not to own her, but to protect her. He had walked through fire for her, had taken blows meant for her, in his fierce, violent defense of her. She had finally understood the true nature of his proposal. It was not about a contract or a claim. It was an offering. She finished cleaning his wounds and knelt before him, looking up into his tired, bruised face. "You did not just save me tonight, Eli," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Back there, and every day since I arrived, you did not just save me, You saw me." He reached out and cupped her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. His gray eyes were full of a deep, vulnerable love that mirrored her own. He leaned down, and she rose to meet him, and they kissed. A kiss of staggering relief and profound gratitude. It was a kiss that sealed every unspoken promise they had ever made to each other. He gently lifted her into his arms and carried her to the bed. There, in the warm, flickering firelight, they made love for the first time. It was not a desperate, passionate coupling, but a slow, tender act of discovery. It was an aching, gentle exploration of bodies that had known too much pain and souls that had known too much loneliness. It was full of unspoken hunger and trembling vulnerability. A final, complete surrender to the love that had grown between them in the harsh, unforgiving soil of the West. Afterward, as she lay curled in his arms, the tears finally came. Not tears of sadness or shame, but tears of pure, unadulterated release. She wept for the lost girl she had been, for the pain she had endured, for the love she never thought she would find. Eli just held her, stroking her hair, his arms a safe, strong harbor in the storm of her emotion. He held her as if he would never, ever let her go. The first light of dawn was a soft, pearly gray, filtering through the single window and painting the cabin's rough-hewn walls in shades of smoke and silver. Clara woke slowly, not to the familiar ache of anxiety in her chest, but to a profound and unfamiliar sense of peace. She was warm, her body nestled against the solid, living heat of the man beside her. Eli. His arm was draped protectively over her, his breathing slow and even in sleep. The faint, masculine scent of him, wood smoke, leather, and the clean smell of the prairie after a rain, was a comfort, an anchor in the quiet morning. She lay still, memorizing the moment. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, orange light on his sleeping face. The bruises from the fight stood out starkly against his tanned skin, a dark testament to the violence he had endured for her. The cut on his forehead was clean, the edges already beginning to heal. She felt a surge of love so fierce and tender it was a physical ache in her heart. This man, this silent, grieving soul, had become her whole world. Last night had changed everything. It had not been an act of possession or a claiming, but a joining, a quiet, sacred acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them. In the shelter of his arms, she had not felt like a ruined woman or a piece of property, but like herself, whole and seen and cherished. And in that feeling, she found a new and startling clarity. She knew what she wanted. She slipped from the bed as quietly as a shadow, careful not to wake him. She stoked the embers, added fresh kindling, and soon had a small, cheerful fire crackling in the hearth. She put a pot of coffee on to boil, the familiar ritual a steadying force. As the rich, dark aroma began to fill the cabin, Eli stirred. He opened his eyes and saw her standing by the fire, her silhouette framed by the gentle morning light. For a moment, he just watched her, a look of quiet wonder on his bruised face. Then he sat up, wincing as his sore ribs protested. Clara brought a steaming tin cup of coffee to him. He took it, his fingers brushing hers. A small, intimate spark in the morning stillness. She did not retreat to the other side of the room. She did not drop her gaze. Instead, she pulled a chair to the bedside and sat, meeting his clear gray eyes with a new, steady calm. "Eli," she began, her voice soft but firm, stripped of all its previous fear and uncertainty. "I am not going to leave." He nodded slowly, a look of profound relief softening the lines around his eyes. "I know. But I want you to understand," she continued, leaning forward, her hands clasped in her lap. "I cannot stay here as your guest, hiding from the world, and I will not stay as a woman you are obligated to protect. I will not be a housekeeper you pity or a mail-order bride you inherited by accident." She took a deep breath, laying her heart bare. I want to stay as your partner. I want to mend the fences with you and pull the weeds and face the droughts and the winters by your side. I want to build a life here, with you, as your equal." He listened to her, his expression unreadable, his gaze never leaving her face. He had offered her his name as a shield, but she was refusing it, demanding something more, something deeper. She was not asking for protection. She was offering her strength. He had seen that strength, had admired it, and now he understood it was the very core of who she was. He set his coffee cup down and stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked to the small chest of drawers, the one where he kept his letters to Sarah, the one Clara had cleaned with such a heavy heart. He opened the bottom drawer and reached into the back, pulling out a small, velvet-soft pouch. He returned to her side, his large, calloused hands cradling the pouch as if it were a fragile bird. He did not speak. He simply knelt before her, just as she had knelt before him the night before, and opened his hand. Resting in his palm was a ring. It was not a fancy, city-made thing. It was a simple, thin band of gold, worn smooth and soft with time. It was not a grand gesture or a legal contract. It was a legacy, a history, a promise. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She gave it to me for Sarah." He looked up at her, his gray eyes shining with a vulnerable, hopeful light. "It is not a claim, Clara, it is an offering. Everything I am, everything I have, everything I hope to be. It is all yours, if you will have it." He was not proposing again with words that could be twisted into a contract of ownership. He was proposing with a symbol, a circle of gold that spoke of a lifetime of love and partnership, offering to place it in her hand for her to accept or refuse, freely. Tears welled in Clara's eyes and spilled down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of overwhelming joy. A laugh bubbled up in her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated happiness. Tears and laughter, mingling together, the perfect expression of the beautiful, painful, improbable journey that had brought her to this moment.
"Yes,"
she whispered, her voice catching.
"Oh, yes, Eli."
He took her left hand, his touch infinitely gentle, and slid the smooth, warm ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. It felt like coming home. They were married 3 days later, not in the cold, judgmental church in town, but on the banks of the small, clear creek that ran through their property. The cottonwood trees, their leaves just beginning to turn gold, formed a natural cathedral, the soft murmur of the water their only music. Their guests were few. The station master, a kind old man named Henry, came and stood as a witness, his face beaming. The blacksmith, a burly, quiet man named Thomas, came with his wife, a small, shy woman who pressed a jar of her finest preserves into Clara's hands with a warm, genuine smile. They were the few souls in Blackwood who had chosen kindness over gossip. The circuit judge, looking bored and eager to be on his way, performed the simple ceremony, his words stripped of all their usual pomp, becoming a simple, straightforward joining of two lives. Clara wore her best calico dress, mended and clean, and in her hair she had woven a sprig of wild aster. Eli, his bruises beginning to fade, stood tall and proud beside her, his hand holding hers with a steady, reassuring strength. Their vows were simple, heartfelt promises whispered to each other under the vast Wyoming sky, witnessed by the ancient, silent land and a handful of friends. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, Eli did not kiss her with the passion of a new lover, but with the profound, reverent tenderness of a man who had been given a second chance at life. Their return to town as Mr. and Mrs. Wade did not magically erase the prejudice against them. The town remained a place of sharp divisions. Mrs. Gable and her circle of pious gossips still turned their backs when Clara passed, their whispers a constant, venomous hiss. Warren Miller, sullen and defeated, would sometimes watch them from the doors of the saloon, his eyes burning with a hateful, impotent rage. But something had shifted. The legal fact of their marriage gave them a legitimacy that was hard to deny. Some of the townspeople, those who had been on the fence, began to see them not as a scandal, but as a couple. Men who had once averted their eyes now gave Eli a grudging nod of respect. A few women, braver than the rest, began to offer Clara a hesitant good morning. She was no longer the mail-order bride, the fallen woman. She was Clara Wade, the rancher's wife, and she carried the name not as a shield, but as a badge of honor, earned through fire and fear. Life on the homestead was transformed. It was no longer a place of silent grief, but a place of shared work and quiet joy. Eli began to rebuild. Not just the fences the wild stallion had broken, but the parts of his ranch he had let fall into neglect, and Clara was beside him every step of the way. She was a surprisingly quick learner, her hands, once soft and useless for ranch work, growing strong and capable. He taught her how to properly milk their new cow, how to mend a fence with the right tension, how to ride not as a passenger, but as a partner with her horse. They worked from sunup to sundown, their shared labor a constant, reaffirming conversation. They were a team, their movements synchronized, their strengths complementing each other. The ranch, which had once been a refuge for Eli's sorrow, was now a testament to their shared future. The vegetable garden thrived under Clara's care, and the cabin was filled with the sense of her cooking and the sound of her humming. Laughter, a sound that had been a stranger to those walls for 3 long years, became a frequent guest. Their life was not easy. The summer that followed their marriage was a brutal one. The sky remained a hard, unforgiving blue for weeks on end. The sun a merciless eye in the heavens. A drought settled over the land, turning the grasses to brittle, yellow straw and shrinking the creek to a mere trickle. The threat of fire was a constant, smoky haze on the horizon. They hauled water endlessly, their bodies aching with exhaustion, their faces etched with worry. Warren's threat remained a dark shadow at the edge of their lives. Sometimes they would see a lone rider watching the homestead from a distant ridge, a silent, menacing presence. The isolation was still profound, the vast, empty spaces a constant reminder of how much they had to depend on each other. But they faced it all together. The hardships did not break them. They forged them, welding their bond into something as strong and resilient as the prairie itself. One afternoon in the late fall, when the rains had finally returned and the land was breathing a sigh of relief, the mail rider stopped by, a rare occurrence. He had a single letter for Clara. She took it, her brow furrowed in confusion. No one knew she was here. She did not recognize the elegant, looping handwriting on the envelope. Sitting at the kitchen table with Eli watching from the doorway, she carefully opened it. The letter was from a woman named Eleanor Vance, back in Boston. "Dear Miss Thompson," it began, "you do not know me, but I feel I know a small part of your story. I write to you in care of the postmaster of Blackwood, hoping this letter finds you well. Several years ago, my sister saw an advertisement you placed in the Eastern papers, seeking a respectable wife for a Mr. Silas Miller, my sister, trapped in a desperate situation much like your own. I imagine, kept the clipping, seeing it as a symbol of hope, a possible escape. She has since passed, but I found the clipping among her things. I find myself now in circumstances that are difficult. I'm a widow with little means and fewer prospects. The West, which seemed so terrifying to me once, now seems like the only place where a woman might be able to start her life anew. I know it is a great impertinence to ask, but you are the only soul I can think to write to. Is it as they say? Is there a life for a woman like me out there? Is there any hope?" Clara read the letter twice, her heart aching with a deep, resonant empathy. She saw herself in every line, in the carefully chosen words that hinted at a deep well of fear and desperation. She looked up at Eli, her eyes shining. "What is it?" he asked. "It is hope," she said simply. She spent the rest of the afternoon at the table, a pen in her hand, a fresh sheet of paper before her. She wrote a long, warm reply to Eleanor Vance. She did not lie or paint a rosy picture of life in the West. She wrote of the harshness, the work, the loneliness, but she also wrote of the beauty, of the vast, open sky, of the strength a person could find in themselves when they were tested. She told her there was a life to be made here, if one was brave enough to build it. She ended the letter by offering to help, to meet her at the station, to give her a place to stay until she could find her own footing. It was the beginning of her own quiet mission, a promise to the scared, desperate girl she once was that no woman who came west seeking hope should have to face it alone. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long, purple shadows across the plains, she and Eli stood by the corral, watching the horses graze peacefully. The wind, once a mournful, lonely sound, was now just a familiar whisper, a part of the song of their life together. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, the worn gold of his mother's ring cool against her skin. She looked out at the endless, beautiful, unforgiving land that was now her home, and a feeling of profound gratitude washed over her. She turned her face up to his and whispered, the words a distillation of their entire story. "You did not just touch my heart. Eli, you made it beat again." He did not answer with words. He simply lowered his head and kissed her forehead, a soft, lingering kiss full of love and peace. And there they stood, wrapped in the cool evening air, two survivors, battered and bruised by life, standing together in the wind, finally, completely home. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.